She was married to a sickly king, burdened with the impossible task of saving a dying dynasty. 11 loveless years without a child turned her into the scapegoat for the Habsburgs' collapse in Spain. Maria Anna of Neuburg, blamed for Charles II's sterility, spent her remaining decades in isolation and political failure. At 72, she died quietly of heart disease, her life remembered not for triumph, but for humiliation, loneliness, and bitterness. Maria Anna of Neuburg was born on October 28, 1667, in Dusseldorf, a city that still carried the scars of war and the ambitions of dynasties. She was the 12th child of Philip William, Elector Palatine, and Elizabeth Amalie of Hesse-Darmstadt. The Rhineland, rich in rivers and fertile land, was also rich in danger. Armies marched across it. Princes bargained over it. And children born there were seldom free from the weight of politics. Maria Anna entered the world not as an individual, but as an asset. A daughter among many, raised in the great stone halls of Dusseldorf Castle, she was taught from infancy that her life did not belong to herself. It belonged to her family's dynasty, to their allies, to the subtle calculations of Europe's map. Her father, Philip William, was a cautious and ambitious man. He had inherited the title of Elector Palatine after years of political maneuvering and conflict. He was not the most powerful prince in Germany, but he understood the value of daughters. Each one was a coin in the currency of diplomacy, and Maria Anna, even as a girl, was groomed to be offered on that table. Her mother, Elizabeth Amalie, was devout and stern. She raised her daughters with discipline, piety, and a sharp sense of duty. In her world, marriage was not romance. It was an altar of sacrifice. And Maria Anna absorbed that lesson like scripture. Childhood for her was not carefree play in gardens. It was the echo of prayers in chapel halls. It was hours spent learning languages, etiquette, and the subtle arts of pleasing and enduring. French, Spanish, Italian, Latin. Her tutors filled her head with words she might someday need to wield as weapons in a foreign court. She learned music, embroidery, and how to sit in silence while others decided her fate. In the corridors of Dusseldorf, whispers floated like smoke. Which kingdom would claim her? Which alliance would her hand in marriage seal? She was reminded daily that her body, her womb, her very existence were pieces of a puzzle larger than herself. Maria Anna was not the first of her sisters to be married off, nor would she be the last. The Neuburg daughters spread like threads across Europe, woven into crowns and courts. One married into the Polish throne, another into the Holy Roman Empire. The family's strategy was simple: place daughters everywhere, so that the name Neuburg would echo in every capital. For Maria Anna, this meant that from her earliest memories, she lived in the shadow of expectation. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed. A princess of the Rhineland could not afford to stumble. She had to embody grace, patience, and obedience. Virtues praised in women, demanded in queens. The palaces of her childhood were not safe havens. They were stages. And Maria Anna, even as a teenager, understood she was being prepared to act a role she had not chosen. But there was also beauty in her world. The Rhineland was a place of rivers that glittered under moonlight, vineyards stretching over hills, and churches that rang with hymns each morning. From her windows, she could see the slow passage of barges down the Rhine, carrying goods and stories from faraway lands. These sights impressed themselves upon her imagination, though they would soon be replaced by darker memories. As she grew, so did the turmoil of Europe. The continent was a chessboard. France under Louis XIV expanded like fire, consuming borders and swallowing smaller states. Spain, once mighty, was fading, its king sickly and its empire stretched thin. The Habsburgs, guardians of tradition, were desperate to preserve their crumbling power. And in this landscape, young women like Maria Anna were pawns waiting to be moved. By the time she reached marriageable age, her destiny was no longer hers. Negotiations took place in candlelit rooms, letters crossed mountains and seas, and decisions were made without her voice. She would not marry for love, nor even for comfort. She would be dispatched, like a soldier to a battlefield, to secure the survival of a dynasty not her own. Yet in her private moments, one imagines she must have wondered, what would it mean to be more than a tool? To live for herself, not for treaties? Such thoughts, however, had no place in her training. They were luxuries she could not afford. In the Rhineland, she was a daughter under command. Soon, she would be a queen under suspicion. The journey from Dusseldorf to Madrid would take her far from the riverbanks of her childhood into the suffocating chambers of a dying empire. And though she could not yet know it, the lessons of silence, obedience, and endurance drilled into her in youth would become her only weapons in the court of Spain. Because in the end, Maria Anna of Neuburg was not born for freedom. She was born to bear the weight of others' ambitions. And from the very beginning, her story was less about life than about sacrifice. In 1689, Maria Anna of Neuburg's fate was sealed. She was 22 years old, her life carefully rehearsed for this moment. The choice was not hers. It never had been. Across Europe, in smoky chambers filled with maps and whispered treaties, her name had been written into destiny. She was to become the second wife of Charles II of Spain. To outsiders, it seemed like a triumph. The Neuburg family had secured for their daughter one of the greatest thrones in Europe. Spain, though weakened, still possessed gold from the Americas, vast dominions stretching across oceans, and a name that once made the world tremble. To marry into such a house was no misfortune, at least on paper. But the truth was darker. Everyone in Europe knew Charles II was not like other kings. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, born from generations of incestuous unions. His jaw was grotesquely protruding, his body frail, his health collapsing under the weight of his bloodline. Rumors said he could barely chew his food. Some whispered he was bewitched. Others said he was more child than man. And above all, one fact was whispered from Vienna to Versailles. Charles II could not father children. Yet dynasties are built on hope, and hope blinds. Spanish ministers, desperate to avoid extinction, convinced themselves that a young bride of good health and strong fertility might produce the miracle heir the empire needed. Maria Anna became that hope. Her first meeting with Charles was less ceremony than omen. The king's pale face, his drooping eyes, his trembling body, these were not the marks of strength. They were the signs of decay. Maria Anna, raised to endure, must have bowed, must have smiled, must have hidden the cold sinking inside her. Her duty was not to love. Her duty was to conceive. The marriage took place with splendor. Gold draped the churches, bells rang in Madrid, nobles feasted, courtiers cheered. It was an illusion, a painted mask stretched over the crumbling face of Spain. Beneath the trumpets and garlands, the air was heavy with fear. For Maria Anna, the wedding night was not a promise, but a trial. She was sent into chambers with a man broken in body and mind. Historians, centuries later, would argue over the details, but the silence that followed spoke loudly enough. Months passed, then years. No pregnancy, no heir, no miracle. At court, the whispers began almost immediately. Perhaps the queen was barren. Perhaps she carried a curse. Perhaps her piety was a mask for sin. The truth that Charles was incapable was known to doctors, ambassadors, and ministers. But truth mattered less than appearances. In dynasties, blame falls easiest on the woman. Maria Anna became a queen without a crown of legitimacy. She fulfilled the ceremonies, processions, audiences, church masses. Yet each step she took was shadowed by suspicion. Each smile was strained. Each silence was interpreted. She was not judged for who she was, but for what her womb failed to produce. And yet, despite the humiliation, she tried. Letters from envoys reveal her attempts to win allies within the Spanish court. She reached for influence through diplomacy, through building factions. But the court of Madrid was a labyrinth of jealousies and ghosts. Ministers loyal to foreign powers pulled strings behind curtains. Priests whispered prophecies of divine punishment. Every move she made fed new rumors, new resentment. She was young, intelligent, and ambitious enough to understand her danger. But ambition without power is a curse. Each effort to secure her position only deepened her isolation. Charles II, meanwhile, wasted away. His seizures grew worse. His mind faltered. He trusted superstitions more than ministers. At times, he seemed a frightened boy trapped in a king's robes. Maria Anna, beside him, could do nothing but watch the empire sink while her own reputation dissolved. Imagine the nights. A queen in cold chambers, kneeling in prayer, begging for a child that would never come. Doctors brought potions, rituals, advice. Priests demanded confessions. Superstitions grew like weeds, and every passing year, the silence of her womb echoed louder in the marble halls. Her marriage was not companionship, it was a cage. She was trapped with a king who could not be a husband. Trapped in a role she could not fulfill. Trapped in a court that treated her as both savior and scapegoat. By 1690, just 1 year after the wedding, the illusion was already breaking. Europe watched like vultures, circling above Spain's throne. France, Austria, Bavaria, all waited for Charles VI to die childless, ready to claim the inheritance of an empire. Maria Anna, in their eyes, was irrelevant. A young woman, but already considered a failure. The cruel irony. Her only chance to prove herself, to give birth, was never within her power. History had handed her an impossible task, and in failing it, she became guilty of a crime she had never committed. This was the fatal marriage. Not fatal for her body, not yet, but fatal for her dignity, her freedom, her future. 11 years would pass in this living tomb. 11 years in which she would learn that silence is not protection, that loyalty is not reward, and that history has no mercy for queens without heirs. The palaces of Madrid were grand. Marble halls, golden altars, endless corridors echoing with ritual. Yet for Maria Anna, they were not symbols of majesty. They were walls of confinement. From the moment she arrived, the Spanish court judged her. She was foreign. She was Neuburg. She was expected to be miracle and mother. And when no child came, she became instead a shadow. Her role as queen was public, but her existence was private sorrow. At ceremonies, she wore pearls and silk, her face trained into serenity. But behind those eyes lived despair. In the galleries, courtiers whispered. Servants watched. Ambassadors sent reports home, and all of them carried the same message. The queen is barren. They called her La Reina Estéril, the sterile queen. a phrase that cut sharper than daggers. It spread in taverns, in sermons, in the streets of Madrid. People laughed behind closed doors. Priests warned of divine punishment. Ministers sighed in disappointment. And Maria Anna bore it all in silence. The irony was bitter. Everyone knew Charles II was incapable. His body was a broken manuscript of centuries of inbreeding. Doctors confirmed his infertility. Foreign envoys wrote it openly. Yet in the theater of power, truth was ignored. The blame was hers to carry. Every day in the palace was a performance. She walked through tapestried halls as if she were still queen. But inside she was erased. A figure present but absent. Crowned, yet powerless. A statue in flesh. Maria Anna tried to adapt. She prayed more, showing her devotion. She spoke carefully, cultivating allies where she could. She kept correspondence with her family in Dusseldorf, begging for advice, clinging to the comfort of words written far away. But nothing eased the weight of her loneliness. She was watched constantly. Every movement became evidence. If she laughed at a feast, some said she mocked her husband. If she wept at Mass, others claimed she regretted her barrenness. The court consumed her image, dissected her silence, invented motives she did not have. And Charles II? He was less husband than ghost. Pale, sickly, frightened, he drifted through the palace like a shadow of kings past. He could not support her, could not defend her, could not even share with her the intimacy of marriage. Their relationship was not partnership, but coexistence. Two figures bound by duty, separated by incapacity. Maria Anna, still young, must have felt her own life dissolving. Days bled into nights, nights into years. No child, no affection, only suspicion. She could see her future narrowing, like a corridor with no door at the end. The courtiers mocked in whispers. They compared her to queens of old, women who gave Spain princes and princesses. Isabella, who bore heirs. Elizabeth, who secured alliances. Even her predecessor, Marie-Louise of Orleans, though childless, had been beloved for her charm. Maria Anna had neither heirs nor affection, only reproach. She grew cautious. She withdrew into herself. Her chambers became her refuge, her prison. She spent hours in prayer before gilded crucifixes, asking God for mercy, for a miracle, for relief. But heaven remained silent. Outside, Spain itself mirrored her decline. The empire was crumbling. Gold shipments from the New World dwindled. Armies lost battles they once would have won. Famine struck. Disease spread. And the people, suffering, looked to the throne for hope. What they saw was a sick king and a barren queen. To them, their sterility symbolized the sterility of the realm. The dynasty was dying, and Maria Anna's empty womb became its emblem. Imagine the cruelty of that burden. To carry not only the grief of personal failure, but the weight of an empire's despair. Every breath she took in the palace was heavy with accusation. Every step echoed with the shame imposed on her. She endured it. She had no choice. Queens are not free to flee. They remain silent pillars until they collapse. Yet within that silence, a seed of bitterness grew. Maria Anna began to see the court not as sacred order, but as cage of vultures. Ministers who smiled at her in daylight conspired against her at night. Allies vanished as her reputation rotted. She learned that loyalty in Madrid was as fragile as wax in the sun. Her only weapon was endurance. She survived by remaining, even when she was ignored. She prayed, she plotted quietly, she endured humiliation. But each year that passed made her less queen and more ghost. By the mid-1690s, she was not remembered for her coronation robes or her noble birth. She was remembered for absence, for silence, for what she could not give. Maria Anna of Neuburg had become a queen in the shadows, present yet erased, living yet forgotten. A woman defined not by who she was, but by what history demanded of her. And when history demands the impossible, it destroys. A queen without children is not a queen. That was the unwritten law of the Habsburg court. Maria Anna knew it. Everyone reminded her of it. The priests in sermons, the courtiers in whispers, the people in songs sung behind closed doors. Even the walls of the palace seemed to murmur it back to her. Barren, barren, barren. The insult became her title. La Reina Estéril, the sterile queen. No longer Maria Anna of Neuburg, no longer daughter of an elector, no longer the chosen hope of Spain, just emptiness given a crown. She had been raised for this role. From childhood, she was taught her body's highest purpose was to give birth to heirs. And yet, in Madrid, her womb became a tomb for expectations. Every month that passed without swelling belly was a public scandal. Every year of silence was an indictment. Charles II's condition was no secret. His doctors knew. His ministers knew. Foreign ambassadors wrote it plainly in their reports. He was impotent, incapable, cursed by the centuries of incest that twisted his blood. But none of that mattered. In dynasties, men's weakness is hidden. Women's supposed failure is exposed. So the blame fell on her shoulders, heavy, merciless. She carried it every time she stepped into chapel, where women prayed with swollen stomachs while she knelt with empty hands. She carried it in court ceremonies, when the eyes of Spain pierced her like knives. She carried it in her chambers, where silence grew thicker than the tapestries. And the cruelty did not stop at whispers. Pamphlets circulated. Anonymous verses mocked her. Some said she had offended God. Others claimed she was bewitched. Rumors spread that she drank potions to avoid pregnancy, or that she confessed sins so dark no child could be born from her. Lies. But lies were more powerful than truth. Her humiliation was ritualized. Each feast, each festival was a stage where her failure was displayed. No prince by her side, no infant carried in her arms. She could not even provide the illusion of fertility. There were moments when she tried to fight back. She doubled her piety, kneeling longer at altars. She performed acts of charity, distributing alms to the poor. She cultivated alliances with ministers, hoping influence might replace maternity. But nothing could erase the mark carved into her name. Barren. In her letters to her family, fragments of her despair appear. She wrote of isolation, of suspicion, of fear that she was being slowly erased from history. She had been sent to Madrid to be savior, yet she lived as scapegoat. And behind the gossip, there was venom. Women at court mocked her openly. Some laughed that she was less queen than nun. Others whispered that Spain's decline, its famines, its military defeats, was punishment for her fruitless womb. An empire's ruin condensed into a woman's body. The shame seeped into her very sense of self. She began to withdraw. Her smiles grew rarer, her silences longer. She drifted through the palace like a ghost. Even her beauty, once noted by ambassadors, was dismissed. They described her as pale, severe, joyless. History remembers queens through portraits of majesty. Maria Anna's memory was painted in tones of emptiness. And yet, in the midst of it, she endured. She learned to harden herself against cruelty, though the cracks were always visible. She carried herself with dignity in public, even when inside she crumbled. She kept praying, though heaven stayed silent. She stayed upright, though the world called her failure. But the humiliation never stopped. For a Habsburg queen, barrenness was not just personal. It was political treason. Without heirs, dynasties crumble. Without heirs, thrones collapse. Maria Anna's childlessness was transformed into Spain's death sentence. And so, even when she had done nothing, she became guilty. Imagine the nights she spent awake, alone in chambers heavy with incense and silence, listening to the breath of a king who could never touch her, never give her the child that might have redeemed her. She must have counted the hours by the tolling bells of Madrid, each chime reminding her of another day of failure. Her humiliation was not sudden, it was slow. A drip of poison. Year after year, it dissolved her name, her dignity, her hope. She did not lose everything in one blow. She lost it in 1,000 whispers. And by the late 1690s, her identity was no longer Maria Anna of Neuburg. It was the barren queen. That is how she lived. That is how she was remembered. Not for her mind, not for her will, only for what she could not give. This was the cruelty of dynastic power. It demanded miracles from women and condemned them when miracles did not come. Maria Anna had entered Madrid as a bride of promise. She remained as a queen of humiliation, and in those long years of silence, her soul was slowly consumed by the shame of a body that history refused to forgive. By the mid-1690s, the decline of Charles II was undeniable. The King of Spain was only in his 30s, yet his body belonged to an old man. His face was pale, stretched by the heavy Habsburg jaw. His lips drooled, his eyes wandered, his body convulsed without warning. At times, he could not walk. At others, he could not think. Ministers waited outside his chambers for hours, only to be told the king was too weak to speak. The court lived in dread. Would he survive the night? Would he rise the next morning? Each day felt like the last. Maria Anna watched it all. She was not merely wife, but witness to the unraveling of a dynasty. The man she had been ordered to marry was vanishing before her eyes, his mind slipping further each month. Doctors swarmed like flies. They prescribed potions, fumigations, bloodletting. They whispered of witchcraft. Some insisted the king had been cursed in infancy. Others blamed his mother's sins. He drank remedies brewed from exotic plants, swallowed powders brought from the Indies, endured prayers, exorcisms, and rituals. Nothing helped. His seizures grew worse. His speech faltered. His memory crumbled. And as Charles faltered, Maria Anna fought. She had no child to secure her power, so she turned to politics. She built alliances with courtiers loyal to Austria. She wrote letters to her Neuburg family. She cultivated priests and ministers who saw her as useful. If she could not be the mother of an heir, she would try to be guardian of influence. But each move she made stirred resentment. At court, factions sharpened like daggers. On one side stood those who favored Austria, her side. On the other stood those who courted France, with Louis XIV's Bourbon princes waiting to inherit Spain's crown. Every whisper, every glance, every banquet became battlefield. Maria Anna was young but desperate. She sensed the danger of widowhood. If Charles died without her securing a role, she would be discarded like refuse. So she schemed, cautiously, carefully. But in Madrid's poisonous air, caution was never enough. The people grew restless. They saw famine, war, and decay. They saw their king as half dead and their queen as powerless. Rumors multiplied. Some accused her of poisoning him. Others accused her of lust for power. She was blamed, as always, for what she could not control. And in those last years, Charles himself turned erratic. Sometimes he trusted her, clinging to her prayers, her calm voice, her presence. Other times, he suspected her, convinced by priests that demons circled his bed, that even his queen might be their agent. His paranoia deepened. He would stare at her with suspicion, then beg her forgiveness, then collapse into trembling fits. Imagine her nights then, sitting beside his sickbed, the air thick with the smell of incense and medicine, listening to his gasps, watching his hands tremble as he tried to grasp rosaries he could barely hold. She must have wondered if she was caring for a man or a corpse still refusing to die. Outside his chamber, Europe held its breath. Spain was the grand prize. Whoever inherited its throne would rule not only Iberia, but Naples, Sicily, the Americas. France wanted it. Austria wanted it. England and the Dutch watched warily. Every king in Europe waited for Charles II's death like vultures circling carrion. And in the middle of it stood Maria Anna, young, childless, humiliated, but still queen. She tried to wield what little power she had. She whispered in ministers' ears. She prayed for support from Vienna. She resisted the Bourbon faction. But the more she tried, the more enemies she made. Her presence became polarizing. Some saw her as Austria's agent, a puppet sent to steer Spain into Habsburg hands. Others saw her as desperate woman clinging to relevance. Few saw her as wife enduring tragedy. And Charles? He continued to waste away. By 1698, he was often bedridden. His hair fell out. His skin turned waxen. His body swelled with dropsy. He could not produce heirs. He could barely sign documents. Yet he still clung to the throne. Maria Anna lived in a paradox. She was queen, yet powerless. She was wife, yet unloved. She was blamed, yet essential. For as long as Charles breathed, she still had a place at court. When he died, she would have nothing. So she pressed harder. In council chambers, she tried to push for her family's interests. She maneuvered to secure her own survival. But Madrid was merciless. Each step she took was noted, twisted, reported to foreign embassies. "The Queen conspires," they wrote. "The Queen meddles." Her enemies grew bold. Courtiers mocked her behind fans. Pamphlets accused her of witchcraft, of ambition, of poisoning. She had become convenient villain for every misfortune of Spain. And still, she endured. By 1700, Charles was near the end. His body failed almost completely. He vomited blood. He fell into fainting fits. He could not stand. In his last months, he weighed less than a child. He was 39 years old. Maria Anna stayed near him. Whether from duty, desperation, or habit, she was there. Watching a king die inch by inch, watching her own future collapse with his breath. Those years were not simply decline, they were torment. For Charles, for Spain, for Maria Anna. The final years of Charles II were not only his tragedy, they were hers. For every sigh he breathed, she paid with another wound to her dignity. And when the last breath came, it would not free her. It would cast her into a storm greater than she had ever known. On November 1st, 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled. Charles II of Spain was dead. The last male Habsburg of Spain had breathed his final, fragile breath. Maria Anna, now a widow at 33, stood at the center of a crumbling empire. She had spent 11 years in a marriage without children, without love, without victory. And now, with the king gone, her position collapsed overnight. But the world did not pause for her grief. It exploded. The death of Charles II was not merely the end of a reign. It was the end of a dynasty. His will, written under heavy pressure, named as heir Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. With that signature, the fate of Europe was thrown into chaos. The Spanish throne was no longer Spanish. It was a prize, and every monarch of Europe claimed a right to it. Austria demanded it. France demanded it. Bavaria dreamed of it. England and the Dutch Republic, fearful of Bourbon dominance, prepared for war. The storm was called the War of Spanish Succession. Maria Anna should have been important then. She was the widow of Charles II, still young, still a Habsburg princess by blood. In another time, another place, she might have been regent, or negotiator, or guardian of continuity. But she was not. The Bourbon faction despised her. They saw her as the enemy, the Austrian spy who had whispered in Charles's ear. The new king, Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, distrusted her. To him, she was a dangerous relic of the past, a queen without heirs, a widow with too many ambitions. Her name became poison. Courtiers who once sought her favor abandoned her. Ministers who once listened now turned their backs. She was left in a palace full of ghosts. For years she had been blamed for childlessness. Now she was blamed for factionalism. Every rumor about her was weaponized. She was said to plot with Vienna, to stir rebellion, to poison even the air around the new Bourbon court. And while Europe erupted in blood, Maria Anna faded. The war was vast. Battles raged in Flanders, in Italy, in the Pyrenees. Soldiers died by tens of thousands. Fortresses fell. Cities burned. Diplomats traded lies as often as armies traded cannon fire. But in all those treaties, in all those negotiations, her name was never spoken. She was not regent. She was not trusted. She was not even consulted. Her life, once tethered to the hope of saving Spain, was now a reminder of its downfall. Imagine her isolation. She who had once walked the palace as queen, now reduced to a figure avoided in corridors. Servants bowed out of duty, not loyalty. Courtiers ignored her presence. The new king's ministers pushed her further into the shadows. She became a warning, not a leader. A reminder of failure, not a bearer of hope. Letters from ambassadors reveal the tone. The Dowager Queen is distrusted. Her presence unsettles the new king. She meddles still, but her influence is none. What a cruel shift. From scapegoat of barrenness to scapegoat of intrigue. And while Europe tore itself apart, Marlborough winning victories in Blenheim, Eugene of Savoy marching with brilliance, French armies clashing with Austrian legions, Maria Anna sat in Madrid, a widow with no role. Her family in Dusseldorf hoped she might still matter. They urged her to influence, to resist the Bourbons, to keep Austria's cause alive. She tried. She whispered where she could, wrote letters, kept small circles of loyalists. But every step was watched, every move twisted into evidence against her. To the Bourbon court, she was a traitor. To Vienna, she was a disappointment. To Spain, she was invisible. And yet, she endured. That was her fate. She had endured humiliation in marriage. She had endured suspicion in court. Now she endured irrelevance in widowhood. But the storm outside raged on. The War of Spanish Succession lasted 13 years. 13 years of slaughter, famine, shifting alliances. When it ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, the Bourbons remained on the Spanish throne. Austria gained territories in Italy and the Netherlands. England gained Gibraltar. And Maria Anna? She gained nothing. Her name did not appear in treaties. Her influence did not shape decisions. Her voice was not remembered. When Charles II had died, she might have been a queen mother, a regent, a bridge between dynasties. Instead, she was erased from the very story her marriage had once been meant to save. The storm of succession was not only Europe's war, it was also her eclipse. For while kings and generals carved history, Maria Anna of Neuburg was cast into silence, a widow whose only legacy was the shadow of failure. The irony is sharp. She had been chosen to give Spain an heir, to prevent exactly this chaos. Yet childless, powerless, she had become its symbol. The barren queen, the forgotten widow, the name erased from victory and defeat alike. She did not vanish that day. She lived on, long after the cannon ceased. But in that storm, in the thunder of war, her own voice was drowned forever. When the dust of succession settled, Spain no longer belonged to the Habsburgs. The Bourbon ruled now. And with their arrival, Maria Anna of Neuburg became a ghost no one wished to see. Philip V, the grandson of Louis XIV, looked at her with suspicion. To him, she was not a widow deserving respect, but a threat wrapped in silk. She had once been queen, tied to Austria, the very enemy France had fought for 13 bloody years. He saw her not as dowager, but as danger. Her position crumbled quickly. Once she had commanded attendance, audiences, influence. Now her apartments grew quiet. Courtiers who had once bent to her vanished overnight. Ministers spoke her name only in whispers. Servants performed their duties with the cold precision of obligation, not devotion. She was tolerated, nothing more. The Bourbon court wanted to erase her, and they succeeded. Maria Anna was pushed from Madrid to the outlying city of Guadalajara. Officially, it was to grant her privacy. In truth, it was exile in all but name. There, away from the glittering halls she once occupied, she found herself surrounded not by admirers, but by silence. Imagine her life, a widow of 33, once dressed in jewels, now pacing in half-empty chambers. Once watched by Europe's ambassadors, now forgotten in the margins of dispatches. Once a queen at the center of power, now a relic placed carefully out of sight. Her isolation was deliberate. The Bourbons feared she might stir trouble, might align with Austria, might plot rebellion. So they clipped her wings before she could even attempt to fly. But humiliation followed her still. Pamphlets resurfaced, mocking her again as La Reina Sterile. Not just the barren queen, but now the dangerous widow. She had failed as wife, and now she was framed as threat. The cruelty was unrelenting. Women at court whispered that her exile was deserved, punishment for her arrogance. Priests claimed her misfortunes were divine justice. Even commoners spoke of her as though she carried a curse. What remained for her in Guadalajara? Only memory. She remembered Dusseldorf, the halls of her childhood. She remembered the day she rode into Madrid with hope in her heart. She remembered the cold bed of Charles II, the endless prayers for a child who never came. Memory was both comfort and torment, and in the silence of exile, it became her constant companion. She tried to maintain dignity. She continued to write letters. She surrounded herself with a small household of loyal attendants. She prayed daily, hoping still for mercy, for meaning. But the world had already moved on. Philip V had children. The Bourbon dynasty secured itself. Spain, though scarred, survived under new blood. Europe no longer cared for the barren widow of the last Habsburg king. And so she lingered, unwanted, unneeded, unloved. The cruelty of abandonment was sharper than humiliation. For humiliation still made her visible. It gave her a role, even if hateful. But abandonment erased her altogether. She was no longer insulted in every court, no longer accused in every sermon. She was simply forgotten. History is merciless in this way. Queens who fail to produce heirs are not remembered as women. They are remembered as voids, and voids are erased. Maria Anna must have felt that erasure keenly. Every year that passed took her further from the memory of power. Younger queens took her place. Younger faces filled the court. Her name faded from records, her story reduced to a footnote in dispatches. The Dowager Queen remains in Guadalajara. Nothing more. Abandoned? Yes. Cast aside? Yes. Yet still breathing, still enduring. That was her quiet resistance. But the truth is bitter. Maria Anna of Neuburg was alive, but already dead to history. She walked through her chambers like a specter, moving among relics of a past life, rosaries, faded portraits, old gowns once worn in glory. Each object whispered of a time when she mattered. Now they were reminders of how far she had fallen. Her heart weakened. Her body grew frail. The exile was not brutal in blows or chains, but in silence and neglect. And silence kills more slowly than steel. By the 1720s, she was no longer mentioned even in gossip. She had become invisible, and invisibility is the final cruelty for those once crowned, abandoned by Spain, abandoned by history, abandoned even by memory. Maria Anna of Neuburg was not only a widow in Guadalajara. She was the echo of a dynasty that had collapsed, and echoes do not command power. They fade, they vanish, they die unheard. In Guadalajara, the world grew small. The rooms were fewer, the corridors shorter, the voices quieter. For Maria Anna of Neuburg, life became not a reign, not even an exile, but a slow fading. She was no longer queen, no longer the young bride paraded through Madrid with expectation glittering in her wake. She was a widow, forgotten in a city that barely cared for her presence. Her health declined. The heart that had endured humiliation, suspicion, and isolation began to falter. She suffered from chronic weakness. Her body swelled with dropsy. Sharp pain stabbed her chest. Some physicians whispered of tumors. Others spoke vaguely of decay of the spirit. All agreed she was fragile. Illness fed despair. Day after day, she lingered in dim chambers heavy with incense. The windows opened onto courtyards where sunlight rarely reached. The bells of Guadalajara rang, but they did not call her to power, only to prayer. She spent hours before crucifixes, lips moving in silent pleas. Not for victory, not for legacy, only for peace. But peace did not come. Memories haunted her. She remembered the court of Madrid, the whispers that called her barren. She remembered the endless nights beside Charles, watching him twitch and convulse, praying for a miracle that never arrived. She remembered the storm of succession, the war that consumed Europe, the betrayal of courtiers who had once promised loyalty. All of it replayed in her mind, as if time itself had trapped her in the echo of failure. And so her spirit sank. Depression, though unnamed in her time, wrapped itself around her. She withdrew further into silence. Her attendants, loyal but powerless, recorded her sadness. Some days she barely rose from bed. Some days she sat for hours staring at nothing, her rosary clutched tight, her lips pressed shut. She was 60, then 65, then 70. Years passed like shadows. The outside world barely noticed. Spain moved on under the Bourbons. Children were born. Wars came and went. Treaties were signed. Crowns passed to new brows. Maria Anna's name appeared only rarely, buried in footnotes of ambassadorial letters. The Dowager Queen remains in Guadalajara. A woman once crowned now existed only as a line in forgotten reports. Her loneliness was immense. She had no children to comfort her, no heirs to preserve her memory, no husband, no siblings nearby, no role to play. Even her letters dwindled. Friends died, family ties loosened. She lived surrounded by attendants, yet alone. Imagine the silence of her chambers at night, candles flickering, the air heavy with the scent of wax. Beyond the walls, a city slept. Within them, a queen sat in darkness, listening to her own faltering heartbeat. At times, she sought solace in piety. She financed small chapels, donated to convents, spoke with priests who came to hear her confessions. Religion was her last refuge. But even there, she carried the stain of humiliation. For to be remembered as sterile is to be remembered not for devotion, but for failure. Her bitterness deepened. She had been sent to Spain to save a dynasty. Instead, she was remembered as the woman who could not. She had endured suspicion, mockery, and exile. Now, at the edge of death, she carried no triumph, no vindication, only emptiness. And yet, she endured. That was the cruel miracle of her life. She lived when others wished her forgotten. She lived when her memory was already erased. She lived year after year, as if endurance itself was her punishment. By 1735, she was nearly 70. Few remembered her coronation. Fewer still remembered her in power. To the young generation, she was only a rumor, the widow of a sick king, a ghost in Guadalajara. Her body weakened further. She could barely walk without aid. Breathing became labor. Her attendants described her as pale, thin, fading. Each heartbeat was fragile. Each morning was uncertain. And in those last years, Maria Anna of Neuburg was not queen, not wife, not mother. She was a shadow, sustained only by memory and prayer. History had abandoned her. Spain had abandoned her. Even her own body abandoned her. What remained was the slow erosion of self. For her, the world had narrowed to a single truth. She had been chosen as savior, and she died as scapegoat. The summer of 1740 was heavy. The air in Guadalajara hung thick, pressing against the walls of the palace where Maria Anna lingered. She was 72 now, her body frail, her heart, long weakened, beat with uneven rhythm. She knew the end was near. For weeks, she had been confined to her bed. Pain spread across her chest like an iron hand. Her legs swelled. Breathing came in gasps. The physicians could offer little. They mixed powders, whispered of tumors, prescribed prayers more than medicine. But their eyes betrayed the truth. The Dowager Queen was dying. And yet, no one outside those chambers seemed to care. There was no anticipation of state mourning. No crowds gathered at her doors. No dignitaries waited for news. In Madrid, the Bourbon court busied itself with its own affairs, its own heirs, its own legacy. Maria Anna, once Queen of Spain, faded from the world unnoticed. Her attendants kept vigil. They prayed. They recited psalms in the dim light of candles. They comforted her in hushed tones. But even their devotion could not disguise the loneliness that clung to her. She was dying, but she was already forgotten. It was not sudden. It was a slow fading. Each day her voice grew weaker. Each night her sleep deeper, her breath more ragged. She drifted between pain and delirium, muttering prayers, recalling fragments of her past. Dusseldorf, Madrid, the shadowed throne, the war that followed. Memories came and went like ghosts visiting her bedside. Perhaps she thought of Charles, the sickly king she had been bound to. Perhaps she thought of the child she had never held. Perhaps she thought of the crown that had weighed so heavily, only to slip into nothing. On July 16, 1740, the silence deepened. Her final morning was calm. The bells of Guadalajara rang as they always had. The city moved on, unaware that a queen was slipping away. In her chamber, the candles flickered. Her attendants gathered close. The air smelled of incense and damp linen. Maria Anna, pale and still, whispered a last prayer. Her rosary lay beside her hand. Her eyes closed slowly. Her chest rose, fell, then stilled. No trumpet sounded. No procession awaited. No empire mourned. She died as she had lived after Charles, in silence. The official record was brief. The Dowager Queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, passed away of heart disease at 72. Some added tumors or general weakness. But the words were cold. They did not capture the years of humiliation, the decades of exile, the weight of abandonment. Her burial was modest. There was no grand funeral, no mourning across Europe. No treaties shifted, no wars began. She left behind no heir, no dynasty, no legacy, only a fading name. For a woman once crowned, this was the deepest tragedy. To die without witness, to vanish without echo. History, merciless as always, recorded her only as a failure, the barren queen, the last consort of a broken king. And yet, behind that cruel epitaph, there was still a human heart that had beaten, struggled, endured. Maria Anna of Neuburg had carried the shame of a dynasty's collapse. She had endured the mockery of courts, the suspicion of kings, the abandonment of history. And when death came, it was not release into glory, but into silence. She had lived too long to be remembered, too quietly to be mourned, too sadly to be honored. Her story did not end with bells and banners. It ended with a sigh. And then, nothing. The summer of 1740 was heavy. The air in Guadalajara hung thick, pressing against the walls of the palace where Maria Anna lingered. She was 72 now, her body frail, her heart, long weakened, beat with uneven rhythm. She knew the end was near. For weeks she had been confined to her bed. Pain spread across her chest like an iron hand. Her legs swelled. Breathing came in gasps. The physicians could offer little. They mixed powders, whispered of tumors, prescribed prayers more than medicine. But their eyes betrayed the truth. The Dowager Queen was dying. And yet, no one outside those chambers seemed to care. There was no anticipation of state mourning. No crowds gathered at her doors. No dignitaries waited for news. In Madrid, the Bourbon court busied itself with its own affairs, its own heirs, its own legacy. Maria Anna, once Queen of Spain, faded from the world unnoticed. Her attendants kept vigil. They prayed. They recited psalms in the dim light of candles. They comforted her in hushed tones. But even their devotion could not disguise the loneliness that clung to her. She was dying, but she was already forgotten. It was not sudden. It was a slow fading. Each day her voice grew weaker. Each night her sleep deeper, her breath more ragged. She drifted between pain and delirium, muttering prayers, recalling fragments of her past. Dusseldorf, Madrid, the shadowed throne, the war that followed. Memories came and went like ghosts visiting her bedside. Perhaps she thought of Charles, the sickly king she had been bound to. Perhaps she thought of the child she had never held. Perhaps she thought of the crown that had weighed so heavily, only to slip into nothing. On July 16, 1740, the silence deepened. Her final morning was calm. The bells of Guadalajara rang as they always had. The city moved on, unaware that a queen was slipping away. In her chamber, the candles flickered. Her attendants gathered close. The air smelled of incense and damp linen. Maria Anna, pale and still, whispered a last prayer. Her rosary lay beside her hand. Her eyes closed slowly. Her chest rose, fell, then stilled. No trumpet sounded. No procession awaited. No empire mourned. She died as she had lived after Charles, in silence. The official record was brief. The Dowager Queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, passed away of heart disease at 72. Some added tumors or general weakness. But the words were cold. They did not capture the years of humiliation, the decades of exile, the weight of abandonment. Her burial was modest. There was no grand funeral, no mourning across Europe. No treaties shifted, no wars began. She left behind no heir, no dynasty, no legacy, only a fading name. For a woman once crowned, this was the deepest tragedy. To die without witness, to vanish without echo. History, merciless as always, recorded her only as a failure, the barren queen, the last consort of a broken king. And yet, behind that cruel epitaph, there was still a human heart that had beaten, struggled, endured. Maria Anna of Neuburg had carried the shame of a dynasty's collapse. She had endured the mockery of courts, the suspicion of kings, the abandonment of history. And when death came, it was not release into glory, but into silence. She had lived too long to be remembered, too quietly to be mourned, too sadly to be honored. Her story did not end with bells and banners. It ended with a sigh. And then, nothing.